Today we're going to look at 2 Samuel chapter 6 through maybe chapter 11. There's a lot to look through with yesterday and today's readings. Chapter 6, David is establishing himself as king and is successful in many battles against different nations and lands, and decides that since he is now established in Jerusalem, it's time to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. So they set out and to get the Ark from where it has been. And as they're traveling along the way, it says that the oxygen, whatever the Ark moves, it's unsteady. And a man, Uzzah, reaches out to steady the Ark. And we think that would be good, right? But for whatever reason, God is angered by that, and he strikes Uzzah dead. And another one of those terrible things that happens. And David then, seeing what happens, says, maybe this ark isn't such a great thing to have. But they've been singing and dancing and rejoicing. And when this happens, then David decides, I'm going to leave that ark, here for a while. And 3 months later, he finds out that the man's house and everybody who is associated with that family are flourishing because of the blessing that comes through God, from God, because of the ark being there. So then David, again, I'm going to bring the ark now into Jerusalem. And he goes and retrieves it from there. And as he's coming into Jerusalem, he's singing and rejoicing and dancing, and all of the musicians are playing, and his wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, sees that, and she is embarrassed by and for King David because of his dancing and, because of the lewdness of everything that way. And she calls him out about that. And he says, it was before the Lord who chose me, that I have danced before the Lord, and then we read on, and it says that, the Lord closed her womb. She didn't have any children then for the rest of her life. And chapter 7 begins with the king settled in the palace, determined, thinking, I've got this beautiful place to live, and the tabernacle of God is just, in a tent. It's time to build a temple. And now we're introduced to the prophet Nathan. David speaks that to prophet Nathan, and Nathan said, yeah, it's probably a good idea, for God is with you. However, that night, Nathan has a vision, and he's told, no, King David will not build the temple. I've lived in a tent, ever since. Don't build a temple and close me in. But the promise comes that of David's, I will make a dynasty. In verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up offspring after you. So the promise to King David is of his prosperity. And David's response in verse 18 and 19 is, who am I that the Lord is so mindful of me? And we should ask that same question. Who am I that God looks at me and forgives me? Who am I that I'm important to God? Who am I that I have a right relationship with God? Who am I that I can come to God freely and openly anyhow? Who am I? Just that, we are mere mortals. And really, in the big scope of things, our importance is pretty minimal. It just doesn't. We're important to our family, we're important to community, but in the overall aspect of everything, who am I that God is mindful of me? I think that's a great question. And we go on, and David King continues to be successful, the rest of chapter 7 and 8 in battles against different lands and different nations. And verse 9 of chapter 8, King Toi of Hamath hears about David. He's, they're getting reports from other lands and stuff, and he sends an emissary. He sends people then with gifts for King David to establish peace, to establish a working relationship with him. And so we have a friendly king, rather than everybody, wanting to war and battle and strive to take other people's land. But this king comes with this a peaceful emissary, a peaceful solution, and we want to live together in peace and harmony. And what a beautiful thing. Anyway, and David continues to battle, and verse 15 of chapter 8, David reigns over all of Israel. You know, the kingdom, the southern kingdom, Judah, and the northern kingdom of the other tribes are united now under David. And then chapter 9, David asks, is there anyone left of Saul's household? You know, I mean, Saul and Jonathan, his sons were killed in battle, and you know, that but we remember that, you know, there was this maid who had a nanny, we would probably say today, that had escaped with one child, although the child had been dropped and was now lame. And yeah, so sure enough, that child, someone knows about him. And he says there is, verse 3, remains a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. And the king says, where is he? And well, he's in the house of so-and-so there. And then King David sends for him. And I mean, he's still a young boy. He's still, it's not that many years have gone by. But he comes, and David promises to provide for him because of David's friendship with his father Jonathan, and restores Saul's lambs and Saul, everything then to this son, Mephibosheth. I'm just not very good at pronouncing those names. Isn't that something? But so David restores the prosperity of Saul to Saul's grandson, and to the servants then that are now taking care of, watching out for Mephibosheth, and they till the land, they have the herds, and everything is restored then because of David's friendship with Jonathan, his respect for Saul, and also the love that he has for God. I mean, all of those things tie together. And the chapter 9 ends with Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem. He always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both of his feet. And so we have some of David's goodness coming out. Chapter 10, we have another king of another land that dies, and his son takes charge. He's a new king. And David sends some people to with a message of sympathy and a message of continued peaceful relationships. And this new king, this young king, disrespects David's men. He shaves half of their beards, and someone, one of the other princes, kind of just, going to cause some trouble. Well, do you really think David is sending this as a goodwill gesture? I think there's some sneakiness going on. David is sending these people as spies to spy out and then to come in and attack, and so this doubt is put in there. And I think Satan, Satan is at work in so many different ways, and we see it but anyway, they have been embarrassed, shamed, and David hears of that. And in verse 6, I love verse 6. When the Ammonites saw that they had become odious to David, odious, what a beautiful word, stinky, repulsive, don't want to be near. I mean, it's kind of like we think of a skunk, or there's some of those smells are just odious. I read that word and I just chuckle. I've got it underlined in my Bible. But, they were repulsive to David. And David sends Joab and the army against them. And of course, they are successful. When we get to chapter 11, we have a whole new story beginning. The story of David and Bathsheba. I think I think we'll just continue on in that tomorrow, and we'll look at chapter 11, which is part of today's readings, but we'll put that in together with tomorrow. But just at the reminder that, the story of David and Bathsheba, again, just shows the evil, the greed, the desire, and what's going on within us. And again, we see Satan at work, and it's, we see the balance of good of God and the evil of Satan, and how we as humans are torn apart and pulled, in those different directions. So tomorrow, again, we will start with chapter 11 and talk about David and Bathsheba.